arrived within earshot, just in time to hear her finish a sentence that ended with the words, "Train to Canning?" One of the onlookers began to explain, gesticulating with an upraised arm. But the explanation was in Bengali, and it was lost on her. She stopped the man with a raised hand and said, in apology, that she knew no Bengali. "Ami Bangla jani na." He could tell from the awkwardness of her pronunciation that this was literally true. Like strangers everywhere, she'd learned just enough of the language to be able to provide due warning of her incomprehension. Kanai was the one other outsider on the platform, and he quickly attracted his own share of attention. He was of medium height, and at the age of 42, his hair, which was still thick, had begun to show a few streaks of gray at the temples. In the tilt of his head, as in the width of his stance, there was a quiet certainty, an indication of a well-grounded belief in his ability to prevail in most circumstances. Although his face was otherwise unlined, his eyes had fine wrinkles fanning out from their edges. But these grooves, by heightening the mobility of his face, emphasized more his youth than his age. Although he was once slight of build, his waist had thickened over the years, but he still carried himself lightly, and with an alertness bred of the traveler's instinct for inhabiting the moment. It so happened that Kanai was carrying a wheeled airline bag with a telescoping handle. To the vendors and traveling salesmen who plied their wares on the Canning line, this piece of luggage was just one of the many details of Kanai's appearance, along with his sunglasses, corduroy trousers, and suede shoes, that suggested middle-aged prosperity and metropolitan affluence. As a result, he was besieged by hawkers, urchins, and bands of youths who were raising funds for a varied assortment of causes. It was only when the green and yellow electric train finally pulled in that he was able to shake off the importuning entourage. While climbing in, he noticed that the foreign girl was not without some experience in travel. She hefted her 2 huge backpacks herself, brushing aside the half-dozen porters who were hovering around her. There was a strength in her limbs that belied her diminutive size and wispy build. She swung the backpacks into the compartment with practiced ease and pushed her way through a crowd of milling passengers. Briefly, he wondered whether he ought to tell her that there was a special compartment for women. But she was swept inside, and he lost sight of her. Then the whistle blew, and Kanai breasted the crowd himself. On stepping in, he glimpsed a seat and quickly lowered himself into it. He'd been planning to do some reading on this trip, and in trying to get his papers out of his suitcase, it struck him that the seat he had found was not altogether satisfactory. There was not enough light to read by, and to his right there was a woman with a wailing baby. He knew it would be hard to concentrate if he had to fend off a pair of tiny flying fists. It occurred to him on reflection that the seat on his left was preferable to his own, being right beside the window. The only problem was that it was occupied by a man immersed in a Bengali newspaper. Kanai took a moment to size up the newspaper reader and saw that he was an elderly and somewhat subdued-looking person, someone who might well be open to a bit of persuasion. "Are Moshai, can I just say a word?" Kanai smiled as he bore down on his neighbor with the full force of his persuasiveness. "If it isn't all that important to you, would you mind changing places with me? I have a lot of work to do, and the light is better by the window." The newspaper reader goggled in astonishment, and for a moment it seemed he might even protest or resist. But on taking in Kanai's clothes and all the other details of his appearance, he underwent a change of mind. This was clearly someone with a long reach, someone who might be on familiar terms with policemen, politicians, and others of importance. Why court trouble? He gave in gracefully and made way for Kanai to sit beside the window. Kanai was pleased to have achieved his end without a fuss. Nodding his thanks to the newspaper reader, He resolved to buy him a cup of tea when a cha'ala next appeared at the window. Then he reached into the outer flap of his suitcase and pulled out a few sheets of paper covered in closely written Bengali script. He smoothed the pages over his knees and began to read. In our legends, it is said that the goddess Ganga's descent from the heavens would have split the earth had Lord Shiva not tamed her torrent by tying it into his ash-smeared locks. To hear this story is to see the river in a certain way, as a heavenly braid, for instance, an immense rope of water unfurling through a wide and thirsty plain. That there is a further twist to the tale becomes apparent only in the final stages of the river's journey, and this part of the story always comes as a surprise because it is never told and thus never imagined. It is this. There is a point at which the braid comes undone, where Lord Shiva's matted hair is washed apart into a vast, knotted tangle. Once past that point, the river throws off its bindings and separates into hundreds, maybe thousands, of tangled strands. Until you behold it for yourself, it is almost impossible to believe that here, interposed between the sea and the plains of Bengal, lies an immense archipelago of islands. But that is what it is, an archipelago, stretching for almost 200 miles from the Hooghly River in West Bengal to the shores of the Meghna in Bangladesh. The islands are the trailing threads of India's fabric, the ragged fringe of her sari, the achol that follows her, half wetted by the sea. They number in the thousands, these islands. Some are immense, and some no larger than sandbars. Some have lasted through recorded history, while others were washed into being just a year or two ago. These islands are the river's restitution, the offerings through which they return to the earth what they have taken from it, but in such a form as to assert their permanent dominion over their gift. The river's channels are spread across the land like a fine mesh net, creating a terrain where the boundaries between land and water are always mutating, always unpredictable. Some of these channels are mighty waterways, so wide across that one shore is invisible from the other. Others are no more than 2 or 3 miles long and only 1,000 feet across. Yet each of these channels is a river in its own right, each possessed of its own strangely evocative name. When these channels meet, it is often in clusters of 4, 5, or even 6. At these confluences, the water stretches to the far edges of the landscape, and the forest dwindles into a distant rumour of land, echoing back from the horizon. In the language of the place, such a confluence is spoken of as a mohana, an oddly seductive word, wrapped in many layers of beguilement. There are no borders here to divide fresh water from salt, river from sea. The tides reach as far as 200 miles inland, and every day thousands of acres of forest disappear underwater, only to re-emerge hours later. The currents are so powerful as to reshape the islands almost daily. Some days the water tears away entire promontories and peninsulas. At other times it throws up new shelves and sandbanks where there were none before. When the tides create new land, overnight